We just finished the Stage 2 kit where we put in a 585 cam. We produced 87 horsepower and 89 foot-pounds of torque. And that's a 35% increase over what we started with on this Road Glide. So very substantial. What we're going to do next is the Stage 3 big bore kit where we put on a 3927 big bore. And on this bike that produces 106 cubic inch displacement. If you had a twin cam 88 stock, you would put on this big bore kit. It'd be the same kit but for a different stroke. It has a different piston. That would generate a 97 cubic inch motor. So we're going to go and proceed with the teardown on this and show you what's all involved in getting the job done. First thing we're going to do is pull the seat off. Just need a Phillips screwdriver here to take this fastener off. And this particular seat's got a seat post backrest. I just pull it out. Next we got to get the fuel tank off. The front of the tank has little covers here that we just got to pop off. Decorative cover. And that covers a 9/16 or T40 Torx fastener. So you got one of them on each side. And then you got the two fasteners here in the back that are also 9/16 or T40s. They're kind of a dual driver head, if you will. Take the center bolt out of here for the dash so that I can get to this bolt over here. Pull these front bolts that were underneath those covers. And the other side. Kind of lift up on the tank so that the fastener spins easy. And the tank is essentially loose, but before we take it off we have to deal with all these wires and vents and hoses and stuff. So we're going to pull the dash off. To do that you got to open up the cap for the fuel and pull the fuel cap off. There's a 5/32 Allen right up here in the very front that we'll take out. And we'll lift the dash off. There's two little bendy tabs under here that hold the, just bend them out of the way a little bit and slide all the wires out and the hoses. And then you can pull this hose off right here. There you go. Now that we got the dash off, we got to take the connector off the fuel pump. And just squeeze the tab and slide it off. And set that out of the way. And now you've got your purge line here, or vent. And that's it for the top of the tank. Now what we have to do is come around to the other side of the bike and disconnect the fuel line. Okay, here's the quick disconnect. You just push up on the chrome part and the hose will pop right out of there. And there's a valve that shuts off here, and as well one in the tank, so you know you lose a little bit of fuel here, but for the most part you just pop that off of there, and now we're free to lift the tank off. Lift the tank off, put the cap back on the tank until we need it. Next thing I'm going to do before I go any further is disconnect the battery, the ground, take the ground off. So just a Phillips screwdriver or a 10mm to get this off. As long as we got the ground off, we can move on to disassembling the engine. Pull the plug wires. Got my 9/16 for the horn bracket. Okay, once we got those two bolts out, now we have to deal with the wiring for the horn, and it's just another metal tab here that you can bend out of the way and remove the wire, and then just slide these two terminals off. Doesn't matter which one goes where, so you don't have to keep track of them. But it gets to be pretty obvious when you go to put it together. So while we're here with this harness, we're going to pull off the engine temp sensor connector. And on the bottom side here, there's just a tab that you lift and slide off. So you just lift on this tab here, and it slides right off. I'm going to disconnect the injectors. You just squeeze these two tabs on each side. I'll pull it off here and I'll show you. So you have a connector here that basically we squeeze the outside and then it releases the connector and you slide it right off. Do both of them, and then we can, I guess, remove the front motor mount. That's a T50 Torx. And hold the mount when you get towards the end so it don't fall. Get your bolt out and slide it through. Okay, the next step is to remove the throttle body. In order to do that, there's 4 bolts to 2 flanges that hold it to each head. To get easier access, it's best to take off the engine temp sensor, and you just need a 3/4 inch socket. Slide it over, and then you can get your ratchet in here. And then you just want to break it loose and then get your ratchet back out of the way, because as it threads back, your ratchet's going to interfere with the head. So just break it loose, and generally they thread right out of there. If yours don't thread out, then you can generally get like an extension in here and miss everything. So this one's coming out nice. The bolts that are behind that, these 2 intake bolts, a regular Allen wrench will stick out too far and drag, and of course it'll hit your fins here. So we have like a modified wrench, or you could just take a regular L wrench and then cut it off shorter. And there's of course a variety of special tools on the market that a guy can get in here with. So I just get my 1/4 inch Allen in there and break them loose. Now you don't have to take these out all the way because the flanges are slotted. So you just have to break them loose and get a gap underneath the head of the fastener so that the flanges will slide out. And the other one. And now we need to go to the other side of the bike, and we have a special ball Allen, 1/4 inch Allen wrench that we could get in there from a long ways away. And if you come in with a straight socket, it just won't fit. So this is a great tool for the job. On the other side, pull these Allens loose. And then we have a retaining clip here on the map sensor that you basically take a screwdriver or pointy object and get underneath this yellow tab here and kind of push it out, and then that allows you to get the connector loose here. There we go. Okay, you got a tab there that basically you can squeeze and slide off. And also the throttle by wire servo motor. Pull this connector just to squeeze and slide. The connector tab is on the back side. Slide that off. And now that we got all the bolts loose, it just slides out, and there's a little plastic retainer for the wiring harness on the servo motor wiring. It's right here on the bottom. I'm going to get these fasteners out of here so they aren't falling. Slide this flange off. And if we turn it over, we see it right here. And there again, we can pop that, work that out of there with a screwdriver. Just like so. And there's your throttle body, and you can see the slots in here for the bolts that were on the other side. Now that the intake manifold's off, we'll pull the push rod clips and slacken the push rods, so that when we go to pull the rocker boxes off and the rocker arms out, there's no force on the valve train. So pull them loose. Low budget special tools. out of the way. 2 7/16 wrenches on the S&S push rods. Put that nut all the way down to the bottom on the quickies. And thread the adjuster all the way up to collapse it. It also works best if you have this on the base circle so that the valves aren't open, which the front cylinder is on this. So, there we go. Okay, now we can move on to the rocker box disassembly. There's just 6 7/16 or 3/16 Allen bolts on top of here. Anytime you're working with a cover that has multiple bolts in it, it's always best to work from the outside in so as not to warp the cover and kind of crack them loose. So this particular cover has 6 bolts, you know, 3 here and 3 here. I took the 2 or the 4 corners out loose, and then I did the center ones. So trying to keep your covers from warping as you take something apart, and that's why they have torque patterns when you put something together as well, so that you do a crisscross and start in the center and work your way to the outside. Now when you get to the rear cylinder, of course the rocker box is closer to the frame, so you'll probably have to use the closed end of the wrench, and it's going to be more of a challenge to get those fasteners off. And there are of course specialty tools that are lower profile to get in there, but for the most part you can get it with a standard wrench if you just take your time. So now that we've got all the bolts out, we can pull this top cover and just give it a little shove there, and there you have the rocker box top lid. Okay, next we'll take out the rocker box support and the breather assembly here. So we need a 3/8 ratchet wrench or socket, whichever. Start with these small bolts. And then the 4 main bolts for the rocker arms are a 1/2 inch. Okay, then just lift it out and set it on the bench. Okay, and the next step is to take off the rocker base, and you get 6 bolts here. They're all 7/16 or as well 3/16 Allen in the center. And here again I kind of work from the outside towards the center, just breaking them loose. Now as you take this stuff off, you don't necessarily have to keep track of which one was front and rear, because everything is universal front to rear. So of course I usually lay stuff on the bench so that the front goes where on the right and the rear is on the left, but it's not as critical to keep track of them because it's going to go on with a different head eventually and mate with a different valve stem and all that. But for what we're doing here, it's just a big bore. And then these 2 bolts right here are of course longer than the other 4 bolts. So pretty simple.
All right. Don't ask me about that stuff.
Okay, next thing we can just pull this gasket off so we can get at the head bolts. And we're going to need a 12-point half-inch socket to remove these 4 bolts. Okay, I got the longest ratchet that I can because these are going to be pretty tight. Torque sequence for these bolts going on is 1, 2, 3, 4, so I go in the opposite order when I'm loosening them. And they go tight and just crack them loose and work your way around. Okay, now that we got the head bolts out, we can pull the head off. And of course there's oil in the top here, so as you pull it off and roll it over, it's gonna leak everywhere. So, or you can just carry it upside. So there's the inside of the stock Harley cylinder head. Okay, head's off. Now we're gonna pull the cylinder and just break it loose. Ease it off so the piston don't go slamming around. Okay, and we get the piston up where we can do some work on it. Get the wrist pin clips out and slide the wrist pin out and get the piston off. Now that we got the cylinder off, we're going to prevent the wrist pin clip from falling into the flywheel cavity by inserting a rag here in the bore carefully. And then now we just use a pick and insert it in here alongside. There's a little notch in the piston that you can get alongside that clip. And of course keep your safety glasses on and keep your finger in front of the clip so that it doesn't go flying. But just ease it out of the groove like so. And there you have a clip. Now, a lot of times the wrist pin will, depending on how many miles are on the vehicle, the wrist pin will raise a burr in the clip groove, and then the wrist pin won't want to come out. So we have a special tool here that we use, is piston pin puller. Take the nut and the washer off, stick it through the bore, put the nut and washer back on. And then you essentially thread the wrist pin out of the bore. And sometimes, if they're loose enough, you can just pull on the tool and get the wrist pin to come out of the bore. This one seems to be tight. There, it's starting to come out. And there you have it. Okay, we've got our 106 big bore kit unpackaged here, and a little bit of background on the kit. The pistons are forged aluminum and a performance piston set up with a really tight ring pack so that we can optimize the piston deck height. It fits in the same height or engine height as a stock motor would. So basically putting this on is just like putting on a stock top end. There's no boring of the cases. This is the biggest bore that we felt comfortable going with in the stock case, so there's no machine work. You don't have to pull the engine out to do it. You can just pull the top end off, put this top end on, and run from there. The pistons, when they come from SNS, are the same size front to rear. Okay, they're machined so precisely that we basically just hone the bore to a nominal dimension. And you'll notice that when you take them out of the box, the pistons aren't set in with the cylinder, or may or may not be. So it doesn't matter what cylinder goes with which piston. Pistons are interchangeable front to rear. There's no balancing required, so it's basically a direct replacement for your stock top end, minus of course tuning. Okay, so the next step is we just got our cylinders out of our packages and out of the packaging, and we want to inspect the cylinder for any debris in the passages, because before we want to install them, we got to wash these up. And so you're looking down in these passages, the bolt hole passages, the oil return passages, to see if you have any debris. And if of course you do, maybe there's a chip that got stuck in there from machining and didn't get washed out before it was packaged. That stuff does happen. So certainly inspect your parts and make sure that you get them cleaned properly. To get anything out of there, you can use a pick or like a pipe cleaner and some brake clean to get it clean. So the next step is going to be going to the wash bay and using some hot soapy water to get these things cleaned up, and I'll show you how to do that properly. It's important to wash cylinders because of course they have honing grit in them, basically little tiny rocks and stones that are abrasive to an engine. So when they come out of the package, they look pretty clean, but when you get down on the microscopic level, you'll see definitely that there is some debris in there. And one way to see that is just take a white paper towel and some ATF, automatic transmission fluid, on a rag and wipe it through there, and you'll see definitely that there will be some dark residue on that rag. So what we do is we fill a sink full of hot soapy water, and we just use some Dawn and get the cylinder in there. And I'm just using a regular old shop rag here, just soaked with the soap and water, and just, you know, get down to it, I guess. Scrub that cylinder up good. Get the outside of the spigot, and not too concerned with the outside of the cylinder, you know, but then when you're done scrubbing it, just rinse off all your soap. And then immediately after you're done washing it and blowing it off, drying the part, you need to get some oil on it to keep it from surface rusting. And so before I came to the sink, I brought with me a stack of paper towels and a quart of automatic transmission fluid as well. You could use assembly oil or motor oil, whatever, as long as you keep that surface clean. I like ATF because it's red, and when I wipe it with a rag, I can see that I've got everything clean. Whereas if you use a brown oil, it's a little harder to see any dirt or debris. Okay, so I'm just going to use some compressed air here to blow the cylinder off. Of course, I got my safety glasses on. So right away I'm going to go over here and put some oil on a rag and get wiping on the cylinder. Get the outside of the spigot too. Anything that's steel basically needs to get a little oil on it. And I'll set that one aside and go do the other one. There we have it. Now that we're done washing the cylinders, we need to gap the rings. The reason why we gap rings is when the ring gets hot, of course, it grows. And if you don't have the proper gap, the ends can touch. And of course, when they touch, it'll bind in the bore and ultimately destroy the rings and the bore and everything. So we have to have a proper gapped ring when we assemble this engine. There's a couple of methods for doing that. We have the standard ring filer. You would mount this in the vise and place a ring on here like so, and basically turn the crank and gap it. So that's one method. The Tim Allen method would be the power tool method. Here we have a precision ring grinder. that we can grind and accurately determine how much we take off. It has an indicator on here that shows you in thousandths how much you're taking off, and that's the method, of course, we'll be using today. So we'll set this aside. The other tool that you need to properly gap rings is a feeler gauge with the right range of thicknesses so that you can set your gaps properly. So let's get started with gapping rings. Basically, you take the ring and you put it in the bore that it's going to run in, so that, of course, it shows you the gap that it's going to run in. And what I use the piston, because we want to get that ring as square in the bore as we can, because if it's crooked, the gap is going to open up. So what I use is the piston, and the piston's got a nice flat deck right here underneath the ring lands, if you will. I just push it down with all 4 fingers here on each spot, and of course it's as flat as it needs to be for what we're doing. So I pull the piston out, and you can see right over here is the ring end gap. I'm going to take my feeler gauges, and essentially I'll start kind of small and work my way up. I got a 17 thousandths feeler gauge here. I'm going to try and slide that in between there, and it's not going to go. So I need to go smaller and see exactly what my gap is, so I know how much I want to remove. So I'm going to try a 15 thousandths gap, and that one's tight as well. Here's a 12. And a 12 is starting to go, but it's tight. So I probably got somewhere around a 10 or 11 here. Here's a 10. And the 10 goes pretty free. So the target I'm shooting for in this bore, there are rules of thumb for ring gaps 4 thousandths per inch of bore. And so if you had a 4-inch bore times 4 thousandths per inch, you would have a 16 thousandths ring gap. Some specs are 5 thousandths per inch of bore. So we're going to kind of shoot in between those two, and I'm going to target basically a 17 thousandths gap. And I'm at it down around 10 now, 10, 11. So I'm going to put it in my ring grinder, pull it out of the bore, and put it in my ring grinder, and try and shoot for, you know, a 6 or 7 thousandths removal. So what you're looking for here when you of course mount your ring or hold your ring, depending on whether you're doing the bench grinder or the power grinder, you want to make sure your ring is as, you know, square to the grinding media as you can get it, so that you don't have a crooked gap when you get done. So get this one locked in here, turn on my machine, kind of see where where the indicator stops, and you can zero it. So maybe I've taken off a thou or two. I mean, I can take it out of the ring grinder and come back as I need. So I'm just going to take off somewhere around 5 thousandths. Okay. Now I'm going to go back to the cylinder and confirm how much material was removed. So to me, that's a 17 thousandths gap, or as close as we need to be to one. So we'll move on to the second ring and do the same procedure. Okay, now the gap on the second ring is a little bit larger than the top ring. And the idea there is so that gases don't get trapped between the two rings, and of course make them lose control. If you get too much gas pressure between your rings, of course they can flutter and not seal as well. So if any gases do get by the top ring, we want them to get by the second ring even easier, so that we don't have pressure building up between the rings. So we always shoot for a few thousandths wider gap on the second ring than we do the top ring. So I'm going to check this ring here to see where I'm at to start with. That was a 15. Drop her down here. That's a 9. 11. Alright, there's a 13. 13 is about where we're at. So I want to kind of shoot for 20 to 21. So I'm at 13. I want to take 7 or 8 off of here. Let's see if I can do a little better job this time. 21 fits and slides out, so we're looking good there. I can check it with a 22, I guess, or this one jumps by 2, so here's a 23, and that's not going to go. So 22 fits, but it doesn't drag out. So basically this is a 21, and that's pretty much what I was shooting for. So that's the second ring, and the next step I'm going to do is just check my rails to see what kind of gap I got there. And sometimes a rail will fall right through, so you may not be able to use the, you might have to kind of support it and look at it. This one here is going to sit still for me, so that rail has got a nice wide gap on it. Let's see what we got here. This is a 29, and it's tighter than that. Jump down to a 25 here. So it's between 29 and 25. Not too critical that you know exactly what the number is, but to know that it's not, you know, 60 or 80 thousandths, or that it's not 0, of course. So I would say for this gap, anything 20 to 30 is certainly well a good target for us. So we're going to leave the rails alone. I'll check the other one real quick. The expander is essentially a spring, just pushing out on the rail, so it's a combination of the two that gives you the oil control and the force on the wall of the cylinder. There's a 25. Let's see here. Go down to a 23, and the 23 fits. So basically within spec. Alright, and this expander has probably a, you know, roughly 100 thousandths gap when it's in the bore. And of course that gap is going to close up when you put the rail on there, because the rail is wider than the expander. So it's gonna push that gap together, and when that gap hits, you essentially have a spring being compressed, and that's what pushes out against the wall of the cylinders, the combination of the two, the rail and the expander. So enough about that. I'll move on to the other cylinder. So the next step is to, now that we're done grinding the rings, we wanna file this edge right here, so that we make sure that there aren't any burrs raised, that as this ring in operation rotates around the piston groove, because they are going to move in operation, it doesn't eat away the groove. So we want to have kind of a chamfer on this ring. And so what I'm just going to do is take a hand file, and I'm going to hit this edge, and I'll hit the top edge or the bottom edge as well, so that I make sure that the ring isn't going to produce some wear on the ring groove while it's running. And I'll do this even on the edge that I didn't grind. I'm going to hit this edge here, and then I'll flip the ring over. I'll do the same on the other side, and I'll do that on the top and the second ring to make sure that the rings don't do any damage to our piston. So I just got on the edge of the bench here. I'll set the ring on it and support it with the bench, and I just got a small file. I'm just going to run the file over the edge of the ring here. Just light pressure until I can see, you know, a shiny edge all the way across it. And then I'll flip it over. Now let me do both sides here. Turn the ring for the other side. Just put an edge on there. I can see it shiny all the way across. Flip it over and do the other side. All right, now that we've gapped the rings and deburred the ends of the rings, we want to wipe down the cylinders again, because of course we were grinding on the rings and whatnot. And of course, if you want, you can take the whole cylinder back to the sink, wash it thoroughly again, and then of course wipe it down with oil. So I'm just going to take a paper towel here and a little bit of oil on it. Kind of messy, but gets the job done. Make sure I get all my ring debris out of there. And you can see, you know, there's some brown on there as well. So this stuff does want to surface rust on you because it is such a fine and smooth surface. So I'll do that one's done. Just clean. This time it's coming out basically red. You know, there's still a little bit of brown on there, but it isn't nothing like the first rag. So it's always good to wipe them down right before you're going to go and install. Go ahead and do that on the other cylinder. Also, what I'm going to do is I'm going to wash the piston. Of course, it looks pretty clean, but I'm just going to hit it with some brake clean and blow it off here. Okay. Another thing that people often forget and don't think about is the bore on that wrist pin. It's basically a heat-treated or carburized part, and the ID bore on a lot of wrist pins isn't necessarily, it's a scaly surface, and so it's always good to take a pipe cleaner and a brake clean and run a rag through whatever, but at least swipe through that bore and get that clean. So I got a wrist pin here, and I'm just going to show you here how this one was just out of the package. Why it's important to do this, because there's definitely scale in there and film. So get in there and get all the way through and get all that debris out of there. I like the white rags with the ATF on our ATF's got it's like a detergent type of an oil. It has its own cleaning characteristics, so it's good to put that through there. And I can see as I look through that bore the difference between what I wiped and what I didn't. So always take the time to clean the bore on the wrist pin. Clean all your parts. It's certainly up to the end user to make sure that everything is clean before it goes together. So can't stress enough how important it is to clean all your engine components before you put them together. Okay, we're ready to install the pistons and rings on the rods. This engine here particularly, I guess, only has 1,800 miles, so the wrist pin bushings are good. If you got a bike that has many more miles on it, you may very well want to confirm and replace or correct the issue if there is too much wear on the wrist pin bushing. But for our purposes here, we're going to proceed with installing the piston. Before we do that, we're going to put the O-ring on the oil return side of the dowel pins, and so there's just a little O-ring groove there, and of course we wipe this down with a rag to make sure we don't have any debris. So I'm going to put those O-rings on there so that when the cylinder goes on, they're already in place. On the 106 kit that we're installing, the base is sealed with an O-ring just like the factory cylinder was, and what I'll do with this big O-ring is I'll put it on the cylinder before I install it. Before I put the piston on, wrist pin goes right through the piston. I need to have one of the clips installed, and so we have a special tool that we use, wrist pin installer. I use the wrist pin as a guide because the end of the tool pilots inside the wrist pin, and so I put the wrist pin in the bore loosely. Pistons are directional in our kit, so there's an arrow on here that shows forward, and I of course want to assemble it from this side of the bike, so I'm going to put the wrist pin in on the opposite side. Okay, so I'm going to flip the piston over, put the wrist pin clip in my tool, make sure I got the right side, and I am going to insert the clip. There it goes. Obviously you want to visually confirm that it's seated in the groove, and that one's good to go. So now I can proceed with putting the piston on the rod and inserting the wrist pin. These pistons can be installed front or rear, so they are identical front to rear. Okay, before I put the piston on the rod, I'm going to put some tubing over the studs to protect the piston once I get it on the rod, because it's going to, of course, be free to move back and forth, and I'm just going to put it on the lower side of as gravity wants to naturally make the rod fall to protect the piston. So I've got the wrist pin clip in here. I'm ready to insert the piston, making sure that the arrow is facing forward. And just slide it over there. I'm going to put a little assembly lube on here. And I just put a little bit in the bore here. And then I'll take my wrist pin and dab it in there and spin it around. And of course there's oil on the leading edge of the wrist pin. So it's going to lubricate the bushing as it goes through. And there it is in. Now I need to insert the wrist pin clip. And my tool for inserting. Okay. Not a bad idea to have a rag still underneath here in case you drop the wrist pin clip. So I'm going to stick that back down in here. And insert my clip. Certainly want to make marks on the piston, so that's kind of why we're protecting everything. Alright, the clip went in. I can see that it's in the groove. And everything is moving freely. Now we can move on and install the rings and put them in their proper location. First ring I'll put on, I guess, is the oil control ring, the bottom one. Work my way from the bottom up. It's not real important where the end gaps are at this point because we're of course going to be moving everything around. We'll do that right before we go to install the cylinder. I'm going to start with the expander. And what I want to make sure on the expander is that the ends of the ring, the gap, you can see that it's a wavy shape and the end of it is cut. I want that end gap to face up where it's cut. So I would not want to install this ring flipped 180 with the gaps facing down. And the reason for that is with the gaps facing down, if you look at a piston, you're going to see that there are these little oil holes for the oil to return into the crankcase. And with that gap facing down, if that ring, that oil expander should ever come to the gap in the rail, of course it can catch that oil hole. So if it's facing up, it never will ever catch that oil hole because there are no oil holes on the top of the oil ring groove. Okay, so maybe too much information, but nevertheless there's a reason for what we do when we assemble these things. So I have the expander gap facing up, put my rail on, and I guess when I put my rail on, I'm automatically going to put the gap, I would say at least an inch away from the end gap of the expander. So the gap of my expander is here, the gap of my rail is here. Now the gap of my rail could be here, 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 just as long as it's away from the end gap of the expander. Okay, and the top, I'm going to put the top rail on, keeping the gap away from my expander gap. Okay, so there's the oil control ring. Now I'm going to go on to the second ring. Remember the second ring has either a letter or a dot on it. This one particular has a letter, and going to install that in the way that I install these. There are tools, of course, where you can spread rings and just slide them over. I'm doing it by hand here. I'll just put it in the groove and spin it around and then pull it out. It certainly is possible, because these rings are so hard, to break a ring, and not an uncommon phone call if you're not careful with your rings to have a broken ring set. Okay, and now the top ring, of course this one has the letter on it or the dot, and I'm going to put the letter up and walk it around. Okay, all my rings are on my rear piston. I got my arrow facing forward, all my wrist pin clips are seated. Now I'm at a point where I can lubricate the rings and you know, spin them around and kind of get some oil down in the grooves, because the piston, of course, sees the most pressure in the engine and the most heat. So we want to give it every chance we can for it to live and break in. So what I'm going to do is take some assembly lube and just lay a little bead here up on the top, and just kind of saturate it. Get the skirt, get the rings, and walk your way around here. You don't want to have so much on here that it's, you know, just dripping off the piston, but you want to have plenty of it on there. Now I'm just going to kind of roll the rings around and try and get it worked into the grooves a little bit, best I can. Okay, piston, got my rings squared away here. What you want to do is, or what I'm going to do is the top ring here, you'll notice I have the gap over here. This would be the intake side, which would be, relatively speaking, the cooler side of the piston. So I'm going to put the top ring closest to the coolest part of the chamber, and I'm going to put the second ring over here towards the exhaust side. So my gaps aren't lined up, they're apart, and I'm basically saying to put the top ring closest to the coolest part of the chamber and the second ring to the warmest part. And then my expander and my oil ring end gaps, I put my expander gap right here, because when I put my ring compressor on here, you're going to be able to see through the gap in the ring compressor to verify that your expander isn't overlapping or popping out of the groove, because here again, this expander is a really thin ring. It's fairly flimsy. It's easy for it to pop out of place. So we're going to make sure that we visually see it go into the bore and be intact. Okay, so now I'm going to grab my cylinder. I'm going to put this O-ring on the base, and then I'm going to put my ring compressor on here and install the cylinder. Here, I just slid my O-ring over the bore. It just sits on there, and I'll put my ring compressor on here. You can see how this is offset towards the top. It has an arrow on here that says bottom, and the reason why that is if it was a car, you would install pistons from the top of the block. Well, this is a V-twin, so we're installing pistons from the bottom of the block per se. So we kind of flip the ring compressor over here. Get it in place. Have our clamp. Okay, get it on there so that the top of the piston is, you know, a little bit exposed, so that the cylinder can pilot on it, if you will. And I'll put this cylinder in place. Right now is the time we need to remove these tubes that were protecting our piston from the studs. I'll set them aside. Cylinder's wiped down nice and clean. I got my O-ring on. I have my O-ring here on the base dowel as well. So everything is in place. I got to pull my rag out of place here. And we're going to slide the cylinder onto the piston. Okay. I'm going to put a rag underneath this tool here, so when it slides down, it protects that. And then I just slowly push her down. Sometimes it might take a couple of tries, because the rings want to pop out of your tool and do their own thing. Kind of support the piston with my hand, and there she goes. Take your ring compressor off. All right, now make sure you got some good ample lubrication on your skirt to your piston. And as you push it down, if you get, you know, if you want to put some assembly lube on there, just push it down so that it gets past the skirt. And then you can take and just wipe off any lubricant that's hanging on the spigot here, and then slide it down. And the idea is so that you don't leave a big glob of oil here when it goes past the spigot bore. All right, that cylinder is installed. Now that we've got the cylinders installed, we're going to move on to install the stock heads on the stage 3 here and put this thing back together so we can get back in the dyno. The gaskets in the 106 kit are a MLS multi-layered steel gasket. Doesn't matter which direction it goes on, and basically you just line the dowel pins up and push them down on there. They fit kind of snug. I got the stock rear head here I'm going to put on. Set it over the dowel pins, and then we'll put the head bolts in. One thing about the head bolts going together, you want to always put some oil underneath the head of the bolts on all 4 bolts, and then of course down in the threads, so that you don't have friction skewing your torque values. Of course they're going to get really tight, so I'm going to use a little bit of a assembly lube here in each of these bolts. Engine oil or assembly lube, as long as we have some sort of a lubricant here, we're good.
Pardon me? Not necessarily. When he's torquing, you see stuff you might want to say.
Okay, so we're going to torque the bolts down. Torque sequence is 12 foot-pounds, 17 foot-pounds, 90 degrees. They give you a little range, 10 to 12, 15 to 17, so we're just going to go to the upper end of the range. 12, 17, 90, and then it's a 2-stage torque sequence where you go to full torque, 12, 17, 90 degrees, okay, and then you release the torque, you back the bolts off, and you do that all over again, okay. So the first time you torque it, what you're doing is basically conditioning the threads, getting the bolts and the studs to take a seat, and as well any burrs on the head, that kind of stuff, because when you pull the bolts out, you put them in a different hole, that kind of stuff. So basically it's a dual torque sequence. One thing to note, a little hint or tech tip, if you will, is to use a Sharpie when you get to the last round of 90 degrees. You can mark the head bolt basically with a Sharpie, and then when you turn the bolt, you can easily see that you've actually turned it 90 degrees to the start point. So that's what I'm going to do here. Okay, I'm going to back them off. Another thing that I should mention is that the torque sequence on these bolts is also important. You always start on the primary side of the bike and the lowest bolt, if you will, on the V. So you start back here is 1, 2, then you go crisscross to 3, and then 4. Okay, so and as you untorque them, of course, you start with 4, 3, 2, 1, and then on the front cylinder it's basically the same, only flip-flopped in reverse order. So number 1 would be the lowest bolt, farthest bolt down on the drive side, 1, 2, crisscross to 3, then 4, and then the reverse order, 4, 3, 2, 1. So that's all in the instruction sheets, laid out for your reviewing pleasure. Okay, I got them backed off. I'm going to torque them up the second time. Starting with 12 foot-pounds. These top ones are a little tricky. And now I go to 17. And the last step of 90 degrees. And my marks are still on my head bolts, so I can see how far I need to turn them. Okay, the rear head's torqued. We'll move on and put the front end on. Okay, now that we've got the stage 3 installed, we got all the exhaust system, the power tune duals, the SPO mufflers, the 585 cam, the tuned runner intake, and as well the 106 big bore kit. We're going to go break this engine in, and then we'll head over to the dynos for some final tuning and see what kind of power we can make with this combination.